So good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming to this event, and welcome to Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. The topic of today's event is Cities as Innovation Centers, Investing in Resilient Infrastructure. So I hope this is the panel that you thought you were attending. My name is Celeste Connors, and I'm an Associate Practitioner in Residence in the Energy, Resources, and Environment Program here at SAIS, and I'm also the Faculty Advisor to the Student Practicum team that will be presenting today. And so we're delighted to have a panel of experts joining us this evening to also talk about the research. My colleague Josh Soslak, who's the head of Global Resilience at AECOM, and I were actually in London just last week to attend the Commonwealth Heads of Government Business Forum and to actually participate in a soft launch of the report. There's an executive summary available outside, which we encourage you to read, and the full report will be available next month. But the topic of resilience, sustainable development, and innovative green finance was front and center during the conversations among the heads of state at CHOGM. And interestingly, Ernest Hemingway was quoted frequently in the conference in the context of the global effort to address climate change. In the book, The Sun Also Rises, one character says to the other, "How did you go bankrupt?" The response was two ways: slowly and then suddenly. And this relates to the way we see resilience, or need to see resilience. It needs to be integrated into everything we do at the community, national, and international level. And the failure to do so will lead to serious environmental and financial consequences, placing a burden on communities around the world. It will happen slowly and then suddenly. And therefore, it is now my pleasure to introduce Vice Dean for Academic and Faculty Affairs and Professor of African Studies at SAIS, Peter Lewis, to provide opening remarks and kick off the event. Dean Lewis's research and the teaching focus on economic reform and political transitions in developing countries has had a particular emphasis on governance and development in sub-Saharan Africa. And interestingly, his most recent book, Coping with Crisis in African States, examines the sources of resilience and fragility across African countries and presents a series of critical case studies. So we're delighted that Dean Lewis will kick off our event this evening, which will be followed by the student presentation of their research and an expert panel discussion. Thank you very much, Dean Lewis.
Great, thank you, Celeste. It's a pleasure to be here this evening, to see all of you joining us. Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies is delighted to be partnering with AECOM, a leading global infrastructure company, to explore the important issue of resilience. And I look forward to the presentation by our superb team from the program in Energy, Resources, and Environment, Danny Jian, Jingwei Jia, June Choi, and Yan Fan. Our students, in my experience, usually turn in a product that is comparable to or superior to many of the professional products I've seen around town, so it's always a pleasure to hear them present. And then we look very much forward to our panel discussion from a superb group of specialists and practitioners in the field, Josh Saswiak, the Honorable Jo Ellen Darcy, Samantha Medlock, Kevin Bush, and that will be moderated by Celeste Connors. Recognizing that global infrastructure assets are increasingly at risk to the impacts of climate change, this team makes a business case for accelerating investment in resilient infrastructure. And a little bit of background on this, the International Energy and Environment Practicum is a year-long innovative course organized by the Energy, Resources, and Environment Program at SAIS. Students consult for client organizations, providing quality research and analysis on a global policy issue important to the client and applying concepts learned in the classroom to real-world problems. And it really is an exceptional opportunity, both for our students and for our clients, to work together to see the melding in real time on an important project where they can apply the concepts and the methods that they're learning in the classroom to important challenges. This academic year, 7 different practicum projects addressed issues ranging from resilient infrastructure, invasive species, the impact of drilling on water resources, electric utilities in Puerto Rico, forest resilience, and sustainability on the SAIS campus. And that may not be the, the most urgent of issues, the latter, but certainly an interesting one close to our own concerns. It's estimated overall, when we think about the resilient infrastructure challenge, that up to $90 trillion in new investment will be required in urban infrastructure by 2030, more than the entire value of our existing urban infrastructure today. Meanwhile, losses due to weather-related events have been rapidly increasing from a 10-year global average of $12 billion in 1980 to nearly $119 billion today. So there's been a rapid and alarming increase in the costs and the impact of climate-related losses. The 2017 hurricane season alone saw 6 major hurricanes sweep through the Atlantic region, causing $282 billion in damage, $100 billion higher than damages from Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Unless this infrastructure funding gap is addressed quickly, coastal communities will be increasingly at risk to the impacts of climate change. Innovative solutions are needed to meet this challenge, and this is why the AECOM Practicum team's research comes at a critical time, giving us valuable insights on how to move forward. The focus on coastal cities is probably intuitively important, but the research focusing on coastal cities obviously addresses communities that are most vulnerable to climate change but hold the greatest potential to develop innovative solutions. Our students identify the existing barriers to investing in resilience and providing both quantitative and qualitative approaches to overcoming these barriers. So at this point, I'd like to invite the AECOM Practicum team to take the stage to present their research, and we look very much forward to hearing your results. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Lewis, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for making it tonight to our presentation. So our presentation today is about cities as innovation centers, investing in resilient infrastructures. So before we start, I would like to introduce our team members here. This is Danny, Jingwei, June, and myself, Yan. We are second-year students here at the SAIS Energy Resources and Environment programs. So this year, we partner with AECOM, a global construction and engineering firm, to explore the opportunities and challenges for private and public sectors to invest in infrastructure resilience. This is our outline. We'll start by providing project objectives, looking to current overviews and definitions, and we will provide barriers and challenges that are currently exist in infrastructure resilience. Also, we will provide recommendations that address the barriers and challenges, and we will end with 4 case studies that look into how coastal cities are actually implementing innovative solutions to overcome these barriers and challenges. Our main objective today is to identify the ways to materialize the benefit of infrastructure resiliency in order to create a business case to mobilize private and public funds. Global infrastructure are increasingly at risk to the climate-related events. As you can see from this graph, the global insured disaster losses due to climate-related events has been increasing dramatically over the past 2 decades. Failure to invest in resilience now will result in more costly intervention in the future. However, insurance alone is not the solution. As you can see from this graph, the global uninsured losses has greatly exceeded the insured losses over the past couple decades. This trend signals the importance of investing in infrastructure resilience now. So we define infrastructure as the basic physical structures that provide the essential operations of the society. And infrastructure are increasing at risk, which we analyze in 3 dimensions: hazard, vulnerability, and exposures. Therefore, we define infrastructure resilience as the capacity to reduce the vulnerability and exposure to resist, absorb, and recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner.
Thanks, Yan. So, given the context we've been talking about here, we've identified four challenges for investing in a resilience infrastructure, which are the data and information, metrics and standards, governance and regulation, and socioeconomic issues. To address these 4 challenges, we think we need innovative planning, designing, and financing of the infrastructure. The first challenge is data and information. So there is a lack of the data on the infrastructure and the local climate conditions, and also the lack of the data on collecting, monitoring, and analyzing the capacity. Without the robust information and data, we can develop the solutions and strategies to protect ourselves from the climate changes and for the infrastructure. A second challenge is metrics and standards. It is difficult to quantify the indirect socioeconomic benefits of this infrastructure. And also, there are the challenges to measure and rate the performance of the resilience infrastructure strategy. And also, there is a lack of a comprehensive standards and metrics. Therefore, the resilience strategies and assets are difficult to measure the performances as well as to materialize the benefits. The third challenge is government and regulation. There is a lack of the communication and coordination internally among the different stakeholders within the government. There are also the outdated standards regarding the infrastructure development, building codes, and insurance policies, which means it is insufficient to incentivize the investment in resilience infrastructure. The last challenge here we identified is the socioeconomic issues. We think that there's a general lack of awareness on the issue, and we also face a collective action problem, which is who pays and how much are those infrastructure. So this is a picture from Goldman Sachs after Hurricane Sandy in 2011. So the building is the only one that has a lights on in Lower Manhattan. But the question is, when you can have your lights on, but couldn't get your workers to go to work, what is the point of doing this? And from this point, we think that resilience needs to be a holistic effort from different stakeholders.
So we approach the recommendations from broadly 2 approaches, one being quantitative and the next being qualitative. A quantitative approach is necessary for assessing, measuring, and pricing risk, which can ultimately be used for performing cost-benefit analyses, informing decision makers, and also visualizing the amount of what's at stake if we fail to invest in resilience now. The second approach was qualitative. To translate that kind of quantitative analysis into action, it requires clear communication and alignment of incentives across a variety of stakeholders. Danny is going to touch upon this later on. So in our quantitative analysis, we started by asking the risk modeling question: what resilience strategy can best protect the coast of Greater Miami from hurricanes? And as Yan mentioned briefly before, we analyzed risk in its 3 dimensions. The hazard event we considered was the acute event of hurricanes and the chronic event of sea level rise. We looked at vulnerability in terms of the condition of the infrastructure that are exposed to these events, and the exposure as the amount of infrastructure that are exposed to hurricanes on the coast of Miami. To walk you very briefly through what kind of variables that our model captures, we first compared a no investment baseline scenario to 3 different scenarios in which some sort of investment was made in a resilience strategy. We first took stock of the infrastructure assets that are exposed, and then we analyzed the hazard event and its various characteristics. Depending on the resilience strategy that was adopted, there was a reduction in the maximum damage that was exposed to the infrastructure. And finally, in the event of a hurricane, we could conclude and sort of put a quantified number on the cost of the hurricane to the coast of Miami. And using this kind of quantitative analysis, we can apply it to a variety of scenarios, such as reducing insurance premiums, sending the appropriate market signals, identifying business opportunities for those who are interested in resilient strategies, and informing decision makers, again, on quantifying what is really at stake. Here are some of the results from our model. We ran a Monte Carlo simulation of 500 different hurricanes, and you can imagine each one of these dots as representing a hurricane event. On the x-axis, you have the wind speeds of the hurricane and its associated damage on the y-axis. So this graph sort of captures up to 3 billion of hurricanes and damage. We found that when the strategy of flood protection was adopted, the trend line for the hurricane damage decreased. And further, with the installation of architecture for stormwater diversion. And finally, with upgrading the aging infrastructure in the greater coast of Miami, we found that the trend line was decreasing by far the largest amount. To visualize this in its full extent, you can see that the outlying hurricane events can reach up to $9 billion. And subsequently, each of the strategies that we applied successfully got rid of the outlying hurricane events and their potentially catastrophic damaging potential. If we look at the expected value of the hurricanes, in a no investment scenario, we found that the expected value of a hurricane was around $1.5 billion. That figure was reduced to $660 million with flood protection, and further with stormwater diversion. And finally, with upgrading aging infrastructure, we found that the hurricane cost was fully reduced. If we look at the benefit to cost ratio, upgrading aging infrastructure also by far had the highest, in general, highest benefit to cost ratio. One thing to keep in mind is what our model sort of captured was just the damage to physical assets. So these direct costs are what we sort of tried to capture in our model. But the difficulty in quantifying the damage due to hurricanes is difficult because of all these indirect costs related to disruption to business, transportation, school delays, unemployment periods that sometimes last up to months, raw sewage overflow leading also to public health threats, crop yield loss, and fuel price increasing. And finally, if you do try to account for all of those indirect losses, the damage from a hurricane can easily increase up to 100 and 250 billion. And so what this graph shows is that by 2030, you're not only seeing additional risks due to climate change, but also added risk due to economic growth and poor planning in which, for example, we're continuing to build on coasts while undermining the ecological benefits that the natural coast barrier can offer us. So these are really the key dimensions that we need to consider. But Having this quantitative analysis is not enough. If we want to translate this into action, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And so Danny will continue on.
Thank you, June. So starting our qualitative aspect, we first want to start by introducing how infrastructure project gets developed today. And our case study for the infrastructure development is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Alawai Water Canal Project. As you can see in the picture, there's a lot of cleanup that needs to be done, as well as to protect the Waikiki area from the possible flooding situation. So the project gets to take a number of steps. So the project is initiated by sponsor, then goes to a reconnaissance and a pre-feasibility study, then does a cost-sharing agreement between the federal government and the Hawaiian state government, then reaches the feasibility study, which has a number of embedded step within itself. So in the case of Alawai Water Canal Project, it took more than 10 years to complete the feasibility study, but still did not account for the sea level rise scenario. Then goes to approval by Civil Works Review Board, then to federal agency review that requires budget and congressional approval, then requires project development, finally under construction, and then completed with operation and maintenance moving forward. Today, we're at stage where right now is under federal agency review. But keep in mind that this Alawai Canal project started in 1998. And it's been facing significant delays and cost overruns, and where it is expected that feasibility study alone took about $9 million. So looking at this, how we're doing infrastructure today, it is really important to realize that we need to get relevant stakeholders engaged early on in the process to make sure that this process, there's no more cost overruns and delays in the project. For our project, we have identified 4 major stakeholders: government, developers, investors, and community. We believe that collaboration and communication among these stakeholders are important to reduce the risk that are being exposed on our infrastructure asset. For government, it is important to have an overarching framework that deals with resilience strategy and planning, as well as dedicate resources for resilience, and create a transparent and stable regulatory environment, as well as to provide data that the other stakeholders can refer and use. For developers with special technical expertise, it is important to identify the projects, as well as to conduct feasibility study, as well as to engage with locals to provide inputs in the project design. For investors, it is important to analyze the financial risk of not investing in resilient strategies, as well as to look at what are different financial instruments that could be leveraged to attract more private capital into this process. Community engagement is also important for demanding more comprehensive resilient planning to the government, as well as to provide constant inputs throughout the cycle of the businesses to reduce risk and plan resiliency early on in the process. With the proper collaboration and communication with different stakeholders, we can incentivize the development of resilient infrastructure. So on the legislation and regulation side, we could streamline the process of public-private partnership, as well as to provide and have a more robust procurement laws for infrastructure, and provide parcel tax that could fund some of the premiums and insurance, as well as payments for the new financial instruments that we're developing and necessary for resilient efforts. On the modeling analysis side, it is important to disclose the full cost of the damages, as well as to conduct life cycle assessment and cumulative risk that the infrastructure will be exposed to once it's developed. Funding is also an issue. Of the $895 billion invested in climate-related bonds and investment, only 3 to 5% of them are focused on adaptation and resilience effort. And for our case study, we looked at bonds as one possible financial instrument that might be necessary to be structured to fund the resilient efforts. One is like catastrophe bonds, which focus on liquidity and parametric triggers that provides coverages in the time of acute risk event to assist with the quick recovery. And for more long-term resilient infrastructure development, we looked at environmental impact bonds that adjust the returns based on the performance of the resilient infrastructure. Then lastly, looking at climate bonds and how use of proceeds and strict regulations on how the fund can be used in resilient infrastructure is also important to realize as innovative financing mechanism moving forward. To wrap up our presentation, we'd like to present you with 4 case studies, which focuses on Honolulu, Washington, D.C., Singapore, and Rotterdam that are all implementing innovative solutions to address the challenges that we have discussed. We believe that while the world is rapidly urbanizing, and these coastal cities are the most vulnerable areas and communities that are exposed to climate change. However, at the same time, we are confident that these cities will serve as innovation centers to drive the innovative solutions to address some of the challenges in investing in resiliency that we face today.
Thank you, Danny. So on Honolulu, to address the shortcoming of Alawai Watershed Canal project that Danny just mentioned, the Green Growth, the Hawaiian private and public partnership, actually launched the Alawai Watershed Collaboration, which is a platform that aims to engage the entire stakeholders in the early stage, and also to address the stormwater management and flood mitigation. So instead, so compared to a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers project that looks at the canal itself, this collaboration took a very holistic overview in engaging the entire ecosystem of the stakeholder engagement in the entire process.
So for Washington, D.C., Washington, D.C. is one of the first cities in the U.S. to issue environmental impact bonds to reduce the combined stormwater overflow through green infrastructure. One of the challenges in implementing and constructing a green infrastructure is that there's a high performance risk. So environmental impact bonds allows both DC and the investors to share the performance risk in a manageable way. So the way it's designed is that based on how well the green infrastructure does in reducing the stormwater overflow, the amount of return will change. As you can see on the graph, if the green infrastructure perform in range, it will be similar to the yield that you will get at a typical municipal bond. If it overperforms, then you get a higher return. If you underperform, you get a lower return. So that there's an incentive for the investors to also get into the development of green infrastructure project that allows a risk-sharing mechanism to be built in place to attract financing, as well as to look at how environmental impact bonds can be successfully implemented in different resilient infrastructure developments.
So Singapore is a small and city-state and is vulnerable to major floods and storms. So it also doesn't have a sustainable water supply as well as the efficiency of water usage. So the Public Utility Board, together with private developers, has been able to design a smart water infrastructure, which is called Source Pathway Receptor, to capture, redirect, and store the storm water, also to serve as the source of the water supply. So this case study shows that the resilient infrastructure for climate change sometimes could also be used to serve as a way to solve the critical resource challenge, such as a water shortage.
And finally, the last case study that we looked at is Rotterdam. Rotterdam is a unique city in that sea level rise has always been a challenge. 80% of the city would be under sea level currently if it didn't have its network of drainage and canals. So one of the challenges that Rotterdam faces is a stormwater storage deficit. And to address this challenge, the municipal government launched the Green Roof Subsidy Scheme to sort of incentivize and mobilize individual residents to invest in green roofs to sort of collectively serve as a stormwater retention reservoir for the entire city. They have done this in a variety of ways, including 30 euro subsidies per square meter and also tax deductibilities. And sort of the key lesson here is that within 6 years, they were able to mobilize enough residents to cover at least 150,000 square meters in green roofs. And that is pretty significant. And the key lesson is that there was a clear communication of benefits, not just for residents, but also at the city level for storm retention. And through this clear alignment of incentives, it really mobilized action to achieve benefits at the larger scale. And Yeah. So with that, that concludes our presentation. I do realize that was a lot of information that we threw at you. There are a lot of people without whom this could not have happened. And we have invited experts from a variety of sectors to join us today in continuing the discussion on why investing in resilience is a priority today. Thank you. And I'll turn it back to Celeste.
We're going to turn it back to the first. Yeah. And you can turn it off. Right. Okay, great. Which one should I use here? Okay. Thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation and super research that's really, I think, going to help inform our discussion. We've heard that there's lots of barriers to actually doing this correctly, but it's imperative that we do so. I'll be interested to hear the panelists' thoughts on interagency or government coordination, on public-private partnerships, on challenges that you're facing in your respective agency and institution to address these challenges. With that, let me invite our panelists to actually come on to the panel table here as I introduce you. So we have Josh Soslock, and AECOM has actually served as the partner in this research, this collaboration. Josh is the Global Director of Resilience at AECOM, where he is really focusing on all things on the resiliency strategy. In this role, he works across the entire enterprise of AECOM's offerings in planning, design, and construction, and finance and operations. I should note that you should have received a sheet with the panelists' bios on them as you walked in, so I won't go into full detail. Jo Ellen Darcy, who's the former Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works for the U.S. Army. She, in this role, actually served to coordinate. She was longest serving Assistant Secretary in record in this role. And prior to her appointment, she was also Senior Environmental Advisor to the Senate Finance Committee, responsible for environment, conservation, and energy issues. So, Jo Ellen, we're going to look to you to deconstruct that very interesting slide that Danny showed us. And then Samantha Medlock, who's the Senior Vice President and North America Lead for Capital Science and Policy with Willis Towers Watson, which advances insurance capabilities to address risk and resilience. And finally, Kevin Bush, who's the Chief Resilience Officer. He was appointed by the District of Columbia Mayor Muriel Bowser in 2017 to lead citywide efforts to build resilience to sudden shocks and chronic stresses. And so with that, I'd like to start our panel conversation. I'm going to join you down here, and we could probably let me just start with sort of a open-ended question and ask our panelists just down the line to just provide maybe some thoughts on how your respective agency or institution is currently dealing with risk and resilience. And maybe, Jo Ellen, first, though, and you in your previous capacity, that was a really interesting slide that we saw. That doesn't seem to be working very well, and that's just in the U.S. context. I know we'll have this is the School of Advanced International Studies. We're going to look at some international cases as well. We did. What were you specifically trying to do to streamline that effort?
Thanks. Thank you, and I want to thank the students. They've been great to work with, and this is an amazing case study because you've sort of nailed a lot of the problems and also looking to other cities, you know, as to kind of solutions that they've found, and I think it's a great project. But I will deconstruct the slide a little bit because some of the things that are on there have changed since the 2016 and the 2014 Water Resources Development Act. The Water Resources Development Act was what authorizes the Army Corps of Engineers to do their work. It authorizes their projects, it authorizes their policies, and the last two Water Resources Development Acts, and also the Water Resources Development Act of 2007, made a lot of changes to the Corps of Engineers processes. One of the things that was on the slide that has just been implemented, so you all are right on top of it, it's just that this has just happened. The Congress took out the reconnaissance study. So one of the steps that's up there isn't required anymore. What the reconnaissance study did was it was a fully federally funded sort of look at what the project might be. So there was a limit of $100,000 for a study. And what the reconnaissance study was supposed to do would be identify a local sponsor, which is one of the steps up there, as well as is there a federal interest in doing this? Because everything the Corps of Engineers does, every project has to have a federal interest because we're a cost share partner. And so the other steps in there, going through the feasibility study, is still part of the process. But one of the things that was not in the Water Resources Development Act, but that the Chief of Engineers and others within the Corps just instituted about 6 months to a year ago, is they no longer have the Civil Works Review Board. That has been a decision made because that was an extra step. Again, another way to, what the Civil Works Review Board did was review what the districts and divisions did already. And if the districts and divisions are promoting something for authorization to the Congress, that's just another step. So some of those steps, have been taken away. That said, 10 years is way too long for anybody. I mean, it's an investment for both the federal government, because the feasibility study, which is the first step, has to be authorized by Congress as well. The Congress has to say, yes, you can go ahead and do this study, Corps of Engineers, with your local partner. If there's a cost share determined there, 50-50 cost share for paying for the study. And then the federal government has to go to the Office of Management and Budget and the Congress to get the money to pay the federal share, as do the local sponsors who have to go to their either city councils or county commissioners, or in some places their state legislatures, to get the money or to pay for their share of it. Then once the study's done, you have to make the case to the Congress that this should be authorized for construction. In most cases, it's construction of either a lock and dam, an ecosystem restoration project. The Corps of Engineers has probably built its last dam, which was in Puerto Rico, the Portuguese Dam in Puerto Rico, which was completed about 3 years ago. There currently are no more authorized dams to be constructed. That said, one of the things that was pointed out by this study, which is probably one of the most significant things we need to think about as a country, is the investment we need to make in the aging infrastructure, the existing infrastructure. Some of that infrastructure today would not pass test of resilience, but they were built 50 years ago. The average design life for a Corps of Engineers project is 50 years. The average life of the locks and dams in this country are 65 years or more. And so there's a huge need out there for what's existing. There's also a need within the federal government, which the Army Corps of Engineers is undertaking, again at the direction of the Obama administration and the Congress, to do an asset management of what you've got. What you've got now, is it working? Is it not working? Do we need it anymore? Should we be selling it to a local sponsor, or should we just be getting rid of it? We've got some dams in the portfolio that just have no purpose anymore. And they're just in caretaker status, which is costing the federal government money for a project that is not delivering on what it was intended to do. So that evaluation will help too. And also doing it through the lens of resilience and nature-based systems. A lot of these things were built before the science and the technology was there that we have today. So we need to look at those through that new lens as well. And Congress is considering a Water Resources Development Act this month in May. Hopefully they will pass it, and some of the provisions that members are considering are making a requirement for the Corps of Engineers to consider both resilience as well as nature-based solutions for the problems that they have. So that's probably more than you wanted to hear about.
Well, that last point, that's hugely exciting. And certainly we are hearing increasingly about nature-based solutions and how you can actually quantify the benefit of investing in that. Before I continue, I should just note for everyone that this event will be video recorded and available online in about 3 days from now. And I also want you thinking about questions that you might ask, because after our panelists have some introductory words to say, we'll go to Q&A, which would include asking the students about their research. So, Joellen, it seems almost that local governments are compelled to act maybe independently, but also in the spirit of collaboration at the local level. Kevin, you have experience working at the federal level, now at the local level, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. What are you currently doing to sort of invest in resiliency, some of the challenges that you've encountered as well?
Great, thanks. And let me just start off by echoing Secretary Darcy's points. DC has 100,000 students that are in institutes of higher learning here. There's only 700,000 people that live in DC, so just think about that for a moment. We have 4 very exceptional ones over here that did a great job. So kudos again to you all. It was great working with you a little bit and hearing more about your research. So, you know, the students in their presentation talked about exposure and vulnerability. And one thing that the district is doing in our quest toward greater resilience is really focusing in on the vulnerability side of that equation. And so when we think about resilience, we often think about it in the framework of having both shocks and stresses, which is kind of taking it down a little bit from the technical definition of resilience and saying, what are the big acute things that we can reasonably foresee coming on down the pike? And those might be natural disasters, they might be man-made disasters, and they might be economic disasters, right? And when I think about these issues, you know, I'm reminded of, I can't remember who it was now when I was at HUD, but some governor was calling their HUD regional office asking if they could request an emergency disaster declaration for homelessness. So, you know, we went looking through the Stafford Act and, you know, and it does kind of beg a fundamental question, you know, why is that not a disaster in and of itself in some communities? And so, you know, in the district, we obviously have the ever-present threat of terrorism. We also have a potential flooding risk and heat waves, and of course, windstorms like the derecho that we saw not too long ago. But we also have big acute shocks that we could experience, like government shutdowns. 200,000 jobs in the district are federal government jobs. If that institution decides to close down for 2.5 weeks, that has direct and indirect and tertiary effects on our local economy that persist many months after the initial shock of a shutdown. But we can't effectively plan for these big shocks without really looking at the day-to-day chronic stresses, the everyday disasters, if you will, that you might think of as vulnerability. And so, you know, in the district, if you live here, you probably know firsthand that we have some of the highest cost housing in the country. We also have, it would seem, increasingly stressed transportation systems to come with. Part of that is the fact that the daytime population in the district actually doubles. So a lot of people come into DC to work, and that's a lot of people that we need to move around on a regular basis. And that has direct impacts on how well we deal with, say, an earthquake, right? So we're trying to recognize that these planning for these events, planning for the future, can't be entirely the purview of any one agency, but we have to look at how we plan for these day-to-day disasters at the same time that we plan for the big potential disasters. And so what we're focused on right now is the development of a resilient strategy. We just started this process. I like to think of urban resilience as kind of the city's immune system. And so the process we just finished was going into the doctor and getting a physical, right? We looked at a bunch of different existing work that had already been underway. We talked to about 500 people. I personally read all 25 plans that have come out just under this mayor. That's 2015 citywide plans, rather. 900 actions and 160 goals. We went deep. And we used that to diagnose additional tests, right, if we continue that immune system metaphor forward a little bit, right? And so we have some big questions about the district's state of resilience. We're really want to know how to build off the leadership we have already amassed on climate change and really institutionalize climate action, not just within district government, but outside district government. We want to know how we can better integrate planning and execution, how we can respond to and leverage technological change. My counterpart in Atlanta, this has been her job basically the last month, is responding from this ransomware attack that crippled city services. And we also want to know what the different levers of economic mobility are at a particular place, I mean, at the neighborhood level, right? So if you grow up in a district zip code, wouldn't it be great if that meant that you were statistically more likely to climb the economic ladder? And then the last big question we have is kind of, if you don't know it already, 2018 is the year of the Anacostia. It's the 200th anniversary of Frederick Douglass's birth. It's the 100th and 50th, some anniversary of the Anacostia Waterfront Park, DC's forgotten national park. And so how do we truly honor the Anacostia for the world-class river that it is and recognize that so many of the critical issues that DC is dealing with come together at that river? So we're really taking this kind of broad view and diving deep on some of the vulnerability questions to plan for and ensure that we thrive in the face of any change.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Kevin. And I hope we continue to hear more about those events and that everyone here participates and supports the city's effort. And I think one of the things I've observed working with cities is that you're constantly strapped for cash, just the way the budgets are put together, but also the cities in many cases are actually carrying a lot of this risk currently in the event of just an extreme event or just the daily shocks and stressors, as you said. So Samantha, let me ask you and turn this over to you that generally, what do you see as your role in this in helping to move some of this risk off the backs of local counties and cities? And also just maybe a comment on the data gap that we heard from the student presentation, because certainly data is critically important to your operations.
Yeah, you're quite right. It really, in many ways, begins and ends with data. So that's a theme you'll probably hear from me a few times in our discussion this evening. First, I really want to, again, just echo the applause for the fantastic work that the students have done. And there were so many aspects of that that I found remarkable that really align with the trends that we're seeing more broadly, and also that we all experienced in our previous roles in the previous administration. And I certainly see continuing forward now that I've landed in what I consider to be the deep end of the private sector for the first time in my career. So I come to this through the lens of as a former local government official and former public official from the federal government, recognizing that at the end of the day, the very best science in the world, the very best data and information, and the best modeling, and even that other critical ingredient, the best relationships. When everybody's come together toward a single purpose goal, if there's not the capital available to get in there and pay for what's needed in terms of infrastructure resilience and upgrades, or designing and building strong communities at the outset, then these exist as really beautiful plans on the shelf and really great relationships where we can all come together and read the latest infrastructure report card from the American Society of Civil Engineers, for example. So I chose to enter the financial sector very consciously and find exactly what I was hoping to find, with a private sector that is vibrant, that is actively engaged, and quite honestly, and I'm going to be very candid because I get to do that now, no matter what happens here in Washington, state and local governments are going to continue to lead the way. And the private sector, particularly the financial markets and the capital markets, are going to continue to use data and information to point us in some very important directions with regard to the return on investment for sustainability and the return on investment for resilience. So let me put a very fine point on that. It begins and ends with good data and risk analytics. The better that we can understand through robust science and sources of data and information about the current state of strength or relative vulnerability of a given asset or a system or a community, the better that we can translate that into a language that insurance and markets can understand. So fundamentally, insurance is about risk and how we go about measuring risk and monetizing that risk. The types of data and information that we rely on would be things like catastrophe models or risk models. We also rely very heavily on engineering information. And in the case of infrastructure and critical infrastructure, understanding how those systems were designed, how they were constructed, and how they've actually been maintained over their life cycle will go into the analysis of the relative risk and the stressors that could be exerted on that particular asset. And this is true whether it's a bridge or a wastewater treatment plant, a dam or a levee, or parts of the electrical grid or other critical infrastructure. But this is also true of institutional systems. So we can be looking at the cyber vulnerability of a particular client, whether it's corporate or public sector. What I've also really enjoyed doing over the last year or so is looking at the way that all of these intersect. What does it mean, for example, for a particular piece of water or flood control infrastructure, what we now call flood risk management, to be vulnerable to certain types of cyber vulnerability or other security threats? And as we look at those intersections, we're really able to come up with a very robust analysis of the relative vulnerability or risk to that asset. Then what we're able to do is articulate for the owner of that risk. In a lot of cases, we're talking about communities or infrastructure owners and operators, the range of options that they have for transferring that risk. And I'll make a very quick distinction. Many of my friends in the audience have heard me make this distinction before, but between indemnity type of insurance and parametric insurance. And I'm going to spend a lot of time on the latter, but let's dispense with the former first. Indemnity being that traditional insurance model, we all carry a certain type of risk around a piece of property, and we transfer that risk to an insurer, and the insurer then provides insurance in exchange for a premium, but in the event of a catastrophe, we'll file a claim. That claim then has to be adjusted. So we'll see the insurer send out a loss adjuster, some smart engineering person with a clipboard, that will look at the harm that we suffered, compare that with the relative damage or the event itself, and see whether that lines up, and then ultimately pay the claim and resolve the claim. But there is a cost to that loss adjustment that is embedded in the premium, and it can actually be quite significant. So let's set aside that model for the moment, and let's talk about parametric insurance, where I'd like to spend a little bit more time. And that is fundamentally the type of insurance policy that was referred to earlier with a catastrophe bond. This is where the insurance basically pays upon a particular triggering event. So in the case of water or the threat of flood or even drought at the other end of that extreme, where we have a certain number of rainless days, a drought parametric insurance policy can pay. An example of this is with the African risk capacity, where my firm has been the broker. And this is a parametric policy that's designed to pay to protect certain kinds of crops in Africa against drought. Once you've got, essentially, I'm simplifying here a bit, but once you have a certain number of rainless days, the policy simply pays. We can design other triggers around extreme rainfall. We can design it around barometric pressure or wind speed. Once a storm reaches a certain pre-agreed upon parameter, the trigger has been breached and the policy pays. There is no loss adjustment, and the immediacy of payment is what makes parametric insurance so important and why it's really gotten traction in the emerging markets. Getting that immediate liquidity out there on the ground when it's most needed to stem humanitarian disaster and to get assistance on the ground when it is so important to help address folks that are in the very near-term stages of response and recovery. But what it also does that's fundamentally important, and why there's a lot of interest in bringing this model onshore here in the United States, is it also helps to address that critical hour, if we could stick with the patient sort of metaphor for a moment, before families get back in their homes, before we've begun to rebuild, before we put assets like critical infrastructure right back where it was before, just as it was before. Parametric insurance can get in there and help rebuild stronger, whether we're talking about homes or infrastructure or other community features like public buildings. So this is where parametric insurance is attracting more attention and presenting some interesting and promising opportunities in communities around the world, including here in the United States. But I'll just emphasize that it really does begin and end with data. The same information that goes into the design of those types of insurance products should also be informing our codes and building standards, because it also, and this is where I'll wrap up, you better believe it is informing the consideration in litigation. And that's the outcome that I think we would all want to avoid as one of the few lawyers trying to keep us all out of court. But the very same sorts of forensic hydrology that we're seeing in the wake of Harvey and other storms bring with it a certain responsibility for communities and asset owners. The more you understand your risk, the more you've got to be acting on it and get out ahead of the next disaster. So I'll wrap up there.
Great, thank you so much, Samantha. And you've invoked lawyers, so this is all getting a bit scary now suddenly. But you also noted the report card, and I'd like just to say that guaranteed the students will get a better report card than the one that you cited just now.
Far better. Well
Looking
done.
at, yeah, $1 trillion infrastructure gap, Josh, and then AECOM. Why does AECOM actually care about addressing resilience, looking at green infrastructure, resilient infrastructure, and maybe just commenting on some of the things that our other panelists have said?
Great, thanks, Celeste. And it is really an honor to be here today, not only because of these amazing students, and I'll talk about them in a second, but this panel of people who I had the great honor to work with in the Obama administration. It's really wonderful to be here. But over the past year, it has been incredibly wonderful to work with these students. They are brilliant. They are incredibly hardworking. And I actually am a little less concerned about our future because I know that there's some really smart people out there thinking about this. And we have some challenges, but we have great people who are going to do stuff, and the rest of us can kind of relax and go to the beach, and or maybe the beach is coming to us. I don't know.
Yeah, right.
That's a little scary. But on behalf of AECOM, this has been a great partnership. My colleague, Stephanie Amonin-Yangason, who couldn't be here with us tonight, has been a great partner in this as well. And unfortunately, she's on business travel. But I did bring my lawyer, and he's sitting in the back of the room. So watch out, Sam.
Good company.
So, Celeste, you asked why AECOM is interested in this. Did we mention that we're a big public firm that is in the business of building infrastructure? So I think that $90 trillion number in global infrastructure need, yeah, that actually gets us a little interested in this space. And that is a number that no government can fund. That's an amount of infrastructure that is way beyond the capacity. And look, there are countries where a lot of public money goes into infrastructure. The Dutch spend the portion of their GDP that we spend on defense on essentially natural defense. My good friend Hank Ovink and Kevin's good friend as well likes to point out that they don't have a whole lot of choice because they can't actually retreat from the sea because they'd become German, and that didn't work out so well for them last time. So we are really interested in this, but I want to talk about that private capital for a second. So why does private capital invest in something? Anybody? Yeah. Okay, actually value, okay? It doesn't necessarily have to be profit, it has to be value. There has to be a return on that investment. Now, that value can be financial, but if I'm a company and I'm building a factory, I'm going to invest in that factory because it's going to allow me to make my product. And what happens to that factory? Now, these are infrastructure assets that have a useful life of 50 or 100 years. When Celeste and I were in London, we were in some buildings that, when the British talk about things that are old, they're talking about like the 11th century. And when they talk about something new, they talk about something that was after the fire, so it's the 17th century. That's the new stuff. What happens in 10, 20, 30, 40 years is a risk to an asset that has a 50 or 100-year useful life. And we don't think that way. We don't think that way as governments. We don't often think that way as companies. Now that's starting to change. Sam and I fought a battle that I don't think we won, but we made a gallant effort to look at how the federal government discounts investments in infrastructure so that you actually can look at value beyond about 3 years. That's a very hard thing. What we're seeing in the private sector is that through some work of the Financial Stability Board and a thing with an acronym called TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, that's about as wonky as you can get, basically the financial markets are learning how to price climate risk. And the insurance companies have been doing this for a long time because that's their business. But investors are starting to look at that. asset managers, pension funds, big institutional investors, your pension fund, and they have all this money. And that money needs a place to go. But they're looking at the physical risk of companies related to climate, the transition risk, the political risk, and they're starting to look at how that works. And so we're at an inflection point in the market. And as AECOM, we see this as an opportunity to help clients not only go back and look at the infrastructure that is aging and how to retrofit that infrastructure, but how to invest in all of the new infrastructure. Every city, like Kevin and every other city in the country, has a capital investment plan. They may have a small resilience budget, but they have a big capital investment plan. And every dollar ought to be resilient. What I think we're really focused on is how do we get everything that we do, every piece of infrastructure that we build, to be resilient from a climate perspective, from a physical terrorism perspective, from a cyber perspective. We look at, and we've, I think, actually trademarked, Chris, converged resilience. What we're really looking at, this idea of the nexus between the physical and the climate and the digital. How do these things work? Because as Sam pointed out, there are vulnerabilities that happen. When the hurricane comes in, the bad guys think, oh, this is a good time to rob them. That actually happens, and we've seen it. So the last thing I wanted to mention was this idea of natural and nature-based infrastructure. And when we started to do the Hurricane Sandy work, there was a big fight internally about gray versus green. And there's lots of folks, typically engineers, who are like, we're going to build a big concrete wall here and that's going to keep the water out. And then there were lots of people who were typically not engineers, but were biologists and ecologists who were like, we want the water to come in because there's lots of good things happen. How do we do that? What's the fight? The answer is not gray or green. The answer is gray and green. It's hybrid. It's looking at the best of both, because you can't, there is no silver bullet. There is no perfect system for resilience. Resilience is a relative term. You have to be resilient to something, and you have to understand the risk and the threat, and then you have to design that bespoke system around it. We can learn lots of things from lots of other places. Case studies are great. But if you're a solution in search of a problem, you're never going to be the right solution.
True.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Josh. I think some of the things that really resonated with me is this distinction. We've got physical risk, which we've seen some of the actual case studies, the physical risk to a catastrophic event. We've got the financial risk. So even as you're trying to rapidly invest in reducing that physical risk, you're still very vulnerable. That's when parametric insurance can potentially play a role. And then we've got this digital risk, which is something people are still trying to wrap their heads around. The other interesting thing I'm pulling from the panel is just where these ideas are coming from. Samantha, you mentioned Africa, ARC. Some of the things we saw in London last week were really fascinating. Fiji introducing the Fiji Green Bond at the London Stock Exchange was really significant, and that is building on Seychelles government launching the Blue Bond. So we've got gray, green, blue. We've got a rainbow of different approaches, financial instruments, and I think we're going to just see more of those. But I want to give our audience an opportunity to ask some questions. This has been both of the expert panel here as well as the students and some of their research. I have some of my own, but actually in the interest of time, I just want to invite folks to come up, and there'll be a microphone that will be passed around. Let's start with 2 questions. You just raise your hand and we'll hand the microphone over to you.
Don't be shy.
Then I might take moderator privilege while you think about one of the things that I've been thinking about just with this panel here is the opportunities for public-private partnerships, both financial and also in a more general term of a public-private partnership. Maybe we could just ask all of you to comment on one most successful case that you've actually experienced recently. Kevin, could start with you, perhaps on a local level.
Successful case of P3. Well, I just started in August, so that said, we do actually have an Office of Public-Private Partnerships, which is still pretty rare for a city. They're primarily focused on vertical infrastructure. I don't know that Seth and I, the director of P3, have done enough scheming yet for me to give you a local example on using P3 for resilience. However, I do think, to Josh's point around how these sorts of things need to be really bespoke, I can give an example of solar and affordable multifamily housing. So, you know, it almost seems like a no-brainer now to get solar on a building, right? Particularly in DC, highest SREX market in the country. Thank you very much. And more power purchase agreements per capita, also, by the way, than anywhere else in the country. I've been studying up on my DC brag points, but anyway.
Well done.
And thank you. So in any case, you would think this is a relatively easy thing to do. But one thing we found out when I was at HUD working with multifamily developers and owners, and I'm thinking of this example, by the way, because Michael Friedberg, who is still leading much of the energy work at HUD, has joined us, is how do you actually make a solar deal happen in a multifamily, an affordable multifamily building is quite complicated. Most multifamily buildings, like most commercial buildings, are single asset entities. So they might be something like 703 West Cornelia, LLC. So even though it says owned and managed by some large company that you might be aware of, it's probably actually owned on paper by a paper company that owns just that building in order to limit the liability. So it becomes very difficult to aggregate the types of benefits that you might get, say, from selling your renewable energy tax credits, et cetera. And if you're an affordable multifamily or a subsidized multifamily housing provider, then it gets even more complicated because your capital stack, the amount of investors that you have in your property could be, 10 pages long, right? And each of them has some sort of review criteria, et cetera. Bottom line, it's really difficult. And so one affordable housing developer in DC, National Housing Trust, they actually came up with a pretty unique model where they created a third-party LLC. So it's a nonprofit that created a for-profit LLC that was called like National Housing Trust Solar or something like that. And so they were now able to take advantage of the renewable energy tax credits because it's a for-profit entity. And what they ended up doing was each of these little LLC buildings actually leased their roof space to this third-party LLC that had private investors in it. And so it was a way to design a bespoke system around some very real barriers that get into the nitty-gritty of that you need a lawyer for, the legal structures, the how do you syndicate tax credits, et cetera, to make these deals actually happen.
Sam, you're nodding.
I
Did
am,
you have a
I
good
am.
example? Yeah.
Yeah, so quickly, and what I'd also like to tee up is a bit of a challenge for all of us in advancing P3 in a really meaningful way in the sustainability and resilience space. But there are a couple of examples that I think are very exciting, and I'm gonna do this through a few levels. But I'd like to start at this very community, local level with one called My Strong Home. So you could visit mystronghome.net, and I had to point out to an audience earlier, it's not my home, but the great work that Julie and the team at My Strong Home have been doing is working to monetize and capture and bank anticipated reductions in the cost of wind insurance that will be realized by the strengthening project of a home. So we've got to, and the idea is to get out ahead of the disaster, right? Parametrics and other things are fantastic. Cat bonds and other things are really great, and they can produce some funding in the event of a disaster. But how do we get out ahead of it, right? And what My Strong Home and this sort of model has been able to do is bank those future savings on the cost of wind insurance, and then use that funding to strengthen the roof in advance of the disaster. So the property owner, and they've modeled this on several hundred homes in the Southeast, where reductions in insurance premium are actually required under state law for properties that meet the standards of the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. And so where those strengthening projects get performed, it's mainly been targeting low and moderate income families and homes. They may need several $1,000s to do the roof strengthening project. The project is done, and a loan is made available, but that loan is repaid through the savings on the wind insurance. And it may take a few years, on average between 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 years, for that loan to get repaid. But the key is, while they're in that home, they've got a stronger roof over their head. And then, of course, once the loan is repaid, then they realize the cost savings and they get that money back into their pocket. So that's, and while it's not a true public-private partnership, it's a model that I think could be blown up in a really big way through approaches with revolving loan funds and other sorts of approaches that could be financed with private capital. Another model that I'll look at is that actually of the National Flood Insurance Program. A program that has been operating under extraordinary debt with no hope of ever being able to repay that debt with premiums any of us would ever want to pay. And I don't want to spend time on why that is. That could take up the rest of the evening or week. But by the National Flood Insurance Program being able to go out on the markets and get reinsurance. They've done this a couple of times, and it has actually already been proven to save taxpayers dollars. They're taking that one step further, though, this year with interest in placing a catastrophe bond for the program. So we see a public program that was stood up by Congress in the late 1960s and quite honestly designed in a way that was going to drive it into debt. So if Congress wants to solve that, and they really need to, it's up for reauthorization right now, they need to get to the fundamentals of the way that program is designed. But FEMA, under its current authority, going after reinsurance, going after catastrophe bonds and insurance-linked securities, is a really excellent public-private partnership. And I have to tell you, the insurers that I'm talking with would have shown up and presented FEMA with a carnival-sized check on the payout for that reinsurance, because we want that proof of concept, and it's been wildly successful. The other area that I'll mention very briefly is coming to market. It's not yet come to market, but the potential for a public-private partnership is really very promising. And that's if we take the model of the parametric insurance policy that I just described and apply it to the municipal scale. For communities that are going to be taking out municipal bonds anyway, to be combining that traditional source of debt with a parametric insurance policy and forming what's being discussed as a resilience bond is a really exciting proposition, because it can help to protect the project, protect the deal, enable the community to have confidence in taking on that additional debt, because in the event of a triggering catastrophe, that payout from that parametric insurance policy could actually help pay back the bond. So a resilience bond is a really interesting model that's getting some pretty good discussion, and I believe will come to market at some point. It's just a matter of time. We've got a lot of communities that are very excited to be second. We're looking for the ones that are nimble, that want to get out ahead of risk and be really the first to come to market and get extraordinary bragging rights. So
that was a clear challenge.
Hint, hint. Yeah.
Let me actually now go to the audience. You've had time to think about some questions of this really exciting panel and the student research, I should say. So please raise your hand. Okay, we have a question here. Let's take 2 at a time, and then we'll go.
Grab the mic
Okay.
early.
Yes, she was first.
Yep. All right. Just please state your name and which organization you're representing.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Whitney Muse. I'm a SICE alum, and I did one of Celeste practicums a couple years ago when I was a SICE student, looking at the Seychelles Green Bond Blue Bond rather was mentioned, and that was part of something that we looked at on the island climate change and resilience and sustainable development challenges. So my question was kind of a little bit answered rather on the local level, which is how are you facilitating differentiated implementation in terms of as regions or aspects of, initially my question was related to DC, as parts of the city are better able to respond or better able to take advantage of the benefits that are offered by these resilience strategies. And since that was answered a little bit on the perspective of the affordable housing question, to the case studies that the students presented, how does that reflected in more emerging economies? All of those are wealthy countries or cities and states that were featured. And so what does that look like in your more emerging economies that have higher debt levels, less access to capital, and those type of things?
And Whitney, where are you right now?
I am at the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners in their International Programs Department.
Thank you. So can we just take one more question? We'll take 2. gentleman over here in the back. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. This is for Josh. I wanted to ask, how can EPC? Sorry. My name is Elliot Ruvelson. I'm a second-year student here at SAIS in the ERE program. I wanted to ask, how can EPC contractors like AECOM negotiate kind of? There's like on the one hand, you have a clear interest in sustainable infrastructure and resiliency, evidenced by your participation in events like this. As well as just the real business case with the kind of practical way that the infrastructure development world works, where you're reliant on bid process and tenders, oftentimes in jurisdictions where they don't care about these sorts of issues. I'm thinking about AECOM right now is building a large component of the new airport in Istanbul, which has been widely derided for its lack of sustainability and the environmental impact. So I'm curious, how does a corporation like yours kind of negotiate those two things? They're obviously conflictual.
Do you want to go first? And then why don't we go
Sure.
international and then work down to the local level? And maybe, Kevin, you want to take that one? And I'll give Joellen, actually, I was going to ask you to comment on P3s too, going back to the original question. So,
Okay.
Josh, why don't you?
So it's a great question. Look, the challenge for us is getting our clients to understand the business case around these investments. And that is what we spend a lot of time doing. Not every client sees it. And it's our job to help them understand it, because quite honestly, when you say they don't care, they may not see it as a priority. Most people care, but the question then becomes, is this what I have money for? Right? Can I afford to do that is a question we hear all the time. Yeah, I'd like to do that, but we can't afford to do it. We don't have budget for that. And the discussion that I often have with these clients is, can you afford not to do it? And when you start to look at it as a risk question, less about sustainability, less about a policy issue, but a pure financial risk issue, now you're talking at a different level within that organization. You're now pulling in the CFO and the risk folks. And they're starting to look at, what's my investment? The trigger, the thing that will make the huge difference in this, and we are seeing this happen, is that the market, the financial markets are starting to price that risk. They're going to price it for companies. They're going to price it for municipalities. It's going to affect your ability to borrow money. It's going to affect your stockholder value, the price of your stock. And so that's really the inflection point, is when that becomes a real risk. Because historically, we've kind of dealt with these as long tail risks that, we kind of disclose in the back of the financial documents and say, yeah, climate's changing and, meteors could hit the earth and aliens may invade and all sorts of bad things could happen, but we're not really dealing with that. And this argument that we can't quantify it, that we don't understand it, we understand much more about climate and the impacts of disasters from a pure qualitative and science perspective than we do about customer behavior. And we make decisions on customer behavior every day in business. So we understand a whole lot about this. Can we tell you precisely how much it will rain or exactly what the wind speed is going to be? No. But we can actually use the tools that we have, and there are some great tools in the insurance industry and in the engineering industry to help quantify that and do a risk analysis. And when we do that, the answer is usually, yeah, we want to be more resilient. It's really expensive to come back and do it later. So it's a lot cheaper to do it on the front end, and that's also part of that business case analysis.
Thanks, Josh. Let's actually, Kevin, can I turn to you to address the second question, or Whitney's
The first question. I
Excuse
think,
me, yeah.
Whitney, you actually wanted an international answer. Okay. Yeah.
And then also to note that Kevin is among a cohort of 100 chief resilience
That's true.
officers
Yep.
that operate globally with Rockefeller. So there's a really vibrant exchange of dialogue, but certainly the local
Yeah,
context here.
We
right?
actually had the mayor of The Hague and my counterpart there here a week or so ago. So, so I would actually make an attempt, be ambitious here because it's Tuesday, to combine both questions. So Josh, your answer on the last one about, that's not what we have, that's not what this money is for, or we don't have money for that, right? I think in large part gets to how I understand, Whitney, your point about differentiated responses too, right? So in the district, I would posit, like most places, at least in America, the areas that are most exposed to risk are also the ones that are most highly vulnerable, even if you control for the risk, right? So, for instance, in the district, we have a neighborhood which kind of juts into the Anacostia River, which is historically a very flexible of a river. It likes to dance, I guess you could say.
Dynamic.
Meanders. There you go. Dynamic and meandering. And it's a neighborhood that has been, for a variety of institutional and structural reasons, it now has a lot of very low-income people of color. And the reason, and there was a study that the Sabin Center did not too long ago about the percentage of public housing properties that were in the floodplain. Well, the land was cheap, and so that's where we had to develop, right? Which is horrible if you think about it from an institutional perspective. But there it is. And so how do we focus on lifting those areas up? And so to combine it with the other question about that's not where we have the money for, and the capital budgeting issue earlier is cities, states, federal government spends money all the time, gobs of money, right? And at the city level, it's often wrapped up in this capital improvement plan that's been mentioned earlier that's probably been cycling through 20-year-old projects when they finally get up to the point where we're about to go get debt to fund those projects. And they might not have been changed in preliminary design since they were initially proposed 20 years ago, but hey, it's their turn, and so we're going to fund it. But the reality is that those projects could achieve multiple community objectives, right? And so we don't set up cities to function this way because when agencies, which have their own individual missions, by definition, they don't have the entire mission of the city, right? So they have their own individual missions. They ask for money for their project. And by the time it gets to review, there's not really any opportunity to co-design the project. But we need more projects like the Marabou Water Gardens in New Orleans, right? Which is basically the product of a need to address flood risk in a highly vulnerable area. But also a community asking for more community amenities for years and years and years and years and years. And so you can go to the Parks Department and say, we want a new park. And you can go to the Emergency Management Department and say, we need to deal with this flood risk. Or you can combine both projects and get what you have in the Chantilly neighborhood, the Marabou Water Gardens, which is a park 360 days a year, and 5 days a year when it's needed, it's a stormwater pump. So it's a park that is designed to flood. No one's going to be in the park in the middle of a hurricane anyways, so it only makes sense, but you're combining multiple streams of money, which I think is what we need to get to, because that 90 trillion, whatever crazy number it was, is totally insurmountable.
All you need is some really generous nuns.
I think you'll explain that during drinks after this.
It will require some wine.
I was going to say, just in the interest of time, I'm going to ask you just to hold your questions. We're going to have a reception to follow, but I do want to actually go back to the P3 question that I had, and Joel, I'll give you actually the last word, because I think what we're hearing just in this conversation, a couple things. Actually, all action needs to be contextualized and localized to align with the values of the community. I'm sure we'll hear, the panelists will agree, students as well in your research, that really when you've got that values alignment, when you're building what the community wants, that's when things actually start to move. But Joellen, just your thoughts on the public-private partnership, because it's complicated, right?
It's complicated, and that's one of the reasons I'm saying we as the federal government haven't done it yet. But in the investments that the federal government is making in water infrastructure in particular, they are very risk averse. That's one of the reasons that I think that we most definitely need as many P3s as we can get. We struggled during the last couple of years of the Obama administration, but we did get some P3s funded. When you have Goldman Sachs stepping up and saying, we're going to invest in this flood control project in North Dakota, I mean, that's great. And that's what we need to encourage. But because the federal government is risk averse when it comes to that kind of investment, I think the encouragement of the private sector, especially with these new instruments that can be devised, we just need to be more educated on what those bring to the table, because it's amazing what there's capital out there to be had, and there is no way that the federal government is going to invest in infrastructure. And I'm just talking water infrastructure. That's not railways, that's not roads, that's not runways. That's just water. You know, if the Corps of Engineers had $2 billion more a year for 20 years, they still couldn't get rid of the backlog of maintenance that they have. And that money's just not going to be there. So what we need to do is definitely encourage things, P3s, P4s, however many people want them, how many ever Ps you want, to be investing in this, because it is the future. And all of those investments, if they can be combined and have the requirement of a resiliency requirement, especially for aging infrastructure, that's the only way we're going to be able to break this.
And that's interesting to note that that's in a developed country context. So let's just put this in a developing country context where you have even more pressures on your budget, more demands, and then ultimately this large overlay of sort of the two sort of global goals that are really dictating a lot of the funding on the international level through the World Bank and the UN on the climate goals, but also on the global sustainable development goals. And even with that, we'll probably increasingly see the need to have localized solutions for implementation, which relates to how we actually build resilient communities. I mean, what an extraordinary presentation by the students and discussion with expert panelists. And please join us after this event next door for some beverages, and want to thank AECOM for their sponsorship and support of the reception. But please join me in thanking the students and the panelists for this exciting session.